There are places where history refuses to stay buried, places where the suffering of the past seeps through the walls, whispers through the corridors, and refuses to be forgotten. The Thornhill Plantation in Louisiana was one of those places. Recently discovered documents hidden for over a century and a half have exposed secrets so disturbing that they challenge everything we thought we knew about one of the wealthiest families in the antebellum South. Letters written in blood-stained ink, diaries that detail unspeakable cruelties. And beneath the soil where cotton once grew, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of crimes that were meant to stay hidden forever. This is not just another story about the past. This is a revelation about power, brutality, betrayal, and the souls who refuse to be silenced. What you are about to hear will disturb you. It will anger you, and it will make you question how such darkness could exist in a place that presented itself as civilized society. Welcome to the true story of the Thornhill Plantation, where no one ever fully died because their suffering became eternal. In 1852, if you traveled down the Mississippi River through Louisiana, you would eventually come upon a sight that took your breath away. Rising from the fertile delta like a temple to wealth and power stood the Thornhill Plantation, one of the most magnificent estates in the entire South. The main house was an architectural masterpiece of Greek Revival style. Massive white columns, each one carved from solid cypress, supported a facade that stretched nearly 200 feet across. Double galleries wrapped around the structure, providing shade from the merciless Louisiana sun. Ancient oak trees, some over 300 years old, lined the mile-long avenue leading to the house, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the humid breeze like grey curtains hiding secrets. But if you looked beyond the grandeur, beyond the manicured gardens and the gleaming white paint, you would see the true foundation of this empire. Stretching for thousands of acres were fields of cotton, and working those fields under the brutal southern sun were over 400 enslaved human beings. Colonel Richard Thornhill III was the master of this domain. Born into money, educated at West Point, he had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it into one of the most profitable operations in Louisiana. His annual cotton yield made him wealthier than most northern industrialists. But his wealth came at a price paid in human suffering. The colonel was known throughout the region as a stern but fair master. That was the reputation he carefully cultivated. He attended church every Sunday, donated to charities, and spoke eloquently about the responsibilities of the planter class. But the recently discovered plantation records tell a very different story. In his private ledgers, found sealed in a vault beneath the ruins of the main house, the colonel recorded every enslaved person as nothing more than property with a monetary value. Men, women, children, all listed with prices next to their names like livestock. But more disturbing were his notes about punishment and control. The colonel employed a man named Silas Blackwood as his chief overseer. Blackwood was notorious, even in a time when brutality was commonplace. He had been run out of Mississippi for killing an enslaved man during a whipping. The colonel hired him specifically for his reputation. Documents show that Blackwood implemented a system of terror. Minor infractions resulted in severe whippings. Attempting to learn to read meant being sold away from your family. And for those who showed any sign of rebellion, there was the punishment cell. A wooden box barely large enough for a human being, where people were locked for days in the Louisiana heat with no water. The enslaved community at Thornhill lived in rows of crude cabins behind the main house. Each cabin, measuring roughly 12 by 12 feet, housed entire families. There were no floors, just packed dirt, no windows, just small openings covered with wooden shutters. During winter, the cold wind whistled through gaps in the planks. During summer, the heat was suffocating. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. During cotton picking season, the work continued until the moon was high in the sky. Children as young as 6 years old worked in the fields. Women who had just given birth were expected back at work within days. The elderly continued until they physically could not stand. But here is what the colonel never recorded in his ledgers. Here is what the plantation records tried to hide. Between 1848 and 1852, over 60 enslaved people died at Thornhill Plantation. The official cause of death was always listed as disease or natural causes. But letters recently discovered tell a different truth. A physician from New Orleans, Dr. Samuel Garrett, visited the plantation in 1851. In a letter to his wife, he described what he saw: evidence of severe beatings, signs of starvation, and several deaths that appeared to be the result of untreated injuries from punishment. He wrote that he reported his concerns to local authorities, but nothing was ever done. The colonel had too much influence, too much money, too much power. The main house itself was a world apart. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with elaborate frescoes. Furniture imported from France filled the rooms. The colonel's library contained over 2,000 books. His wine cellar was stocked with the finest bottles from Europe. On any given evening, you could hear music drifting from the ballroom as the Thornhill family entertained the elite of Louisiana society. The contrast was obscene. While enslaved people starved in their cabins, the Thornhill family dined on 7-course meals, served on china plates, trimmed with gold. While children worked barefoot in the fields, the colonel's son wore custom-tailored suits from London. The wealth, the beauty, the refinement of the plantation house was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering. And at the center of this world of contrasts stood Madeline Thornhill, the colonel's wife. To those who visited, she appeared to be the perfect Southern lady, gracious, beautiful, cultured. But the diaries recently discovered in a hidden compartment of her bedroom reveal a woman whose cruelty rivaled her husband's and whose secrets would eventually contribute to the family's destruction. Now, we want to know what you think about what you have seen so far. Does this story surprise you? Did you know that such detailed records of these atrocities still exist? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Madeline Beaumont Thornhill was born in 1828 into one of the oldest families in New Orleans. She was educated at the finest finishing schools, spoke fluent French, played the piano with remarkable skill, and was considered one of the most beautiful women in Louisiana society. When she married Colonel Richard Thornhill in 1846, it was called the wedding of the decade. But behind the porcelain face and perfect manners lived a woman of shocking cruelty. Her personal diaries, written in French and hidden in a locked trunk for over 150 years, were discovered during a recent archaeological excavation of the plantation ruins. These diaries provide a window into the mind of a woman who viewed enslaved people not as human beings, but as objects to be controlled, punished, and disposed of at will. In an entry from March 1853, Madeline wrote about punishing a young enslaved woman named Celia who had accidentally broken a teacup. The punishment Madeline describes is so disturbing that historians who first read these diaries were physically sick. She ordered Celia to be whipped 20 times, then forced to stand in the sun for 6 hours without water while holding the broken pieces of the cup. But Celia's story becomes even more tragic. Celia had been chosen as Madeline's personal maid when she was just 14 years old. For 5 years, she attended to Madeline's every need, dressing her, doing her hair, sleeping on the floor of Madeline's bedroom in case she was needed during the night. Madeline's diary entries about Celia reveal a disturbing obsession. She wrote about Celia's appearance, her intelligence, even expressed what seems like jealousy over the attention Celia received from male guests. In 1854, Celia became pregnant. The father was never officially identified, but Madeline's diary entries from that period suggest it may have been someone in the Thornhill household. When Madeline discovered the pregnancy, her reaction was swift and merciless. She sold Celia to a plantation in Mississippi, separating her from her mother and siblings, who remained at Thornhill. Celia's baby was born during the journey to Mississippi. According to bills of sale recently uncovered, the infant was sold separately within weeks of birth. Celia herself died less than a year later under circumstances described only as expired from illness. She was 20 years old. But Celia was not Madeline's only victim. The diaries reveal a pattern of deliberate cruelty, particularly toward enslaved women and children. Madeline seemed to take pleasure in separating mothers from their children, often selling young children as punishment when their mothers displeased her. In one particularly chilling entry from June 1855, Madeline wrote about selling a 6-year-old boy named Thomas because his mother, an enslaved woman named Ruth, had looked at her with defiance. The entry describes in cold detail how Ruth begged on her knees, how she screamed when the slave trader took her son away, and how Madeline felt satisfied that proper order had been restored. What happened to Thomas is unknown. What happened to Ruth is documented. 3 months after her son was taken, Ruth was found dead in her cabin. The official record states she died of fever. But a letter from the plantation doctor suggests she had stopped eating and drinking, essentially willing herself to death after losing her child. Madeline's diaries also reveal secrets about her personal life that scandalized even the researchers who discovered them. Beginning in 1856, her entries describe an affair with Dr. Henri Laveau, a physician from New Orleans who held abolitionist sympathies. The affair was conducted in complete secrecy. Dr. Laveau would visit the plantation under the pretense of providing medical care, but Madeline's diaries make clear the true nature of their meetings. What makes this relationship particularly shocking is that their conversations included discussions of abolition and freedom, yet Madeline continued to treat the enslaved people under her control with brutal cruelty. In one entry, she wrote about how Dr. Laveau had argued with her about the morality of slavery, and she had laughed at him, calling him naive and sentimental. She wrote that she enjoyed the contradiction, that it excited her to debate freedom with her lover while maintaining absolute control over hundreds of human beings. The affair continued for nearly 2 years. It ended abruptly in 1858 when Dr. Laveau began helping enslaved people escape through the Underground Railroad. Whether Madeline discovered this or whether he ended the relationship out of guilt, her diaries do not say. What they do reveal is that Madeline knew about his activities and said nothing to authorities, perhaps out of lingering affection, or perhaps because she enjoyed holding this secret as power over him. But Madeline's darkest secret was yet to be revealed, and it involved her own son. Jonathan Thornhill was born in 1837, the only child of Richard and Madeline. From an early age, he was different from his father. While the colonel was stern and authoritarian, Jonathan was sensitive and thoughtful. He loved to read, particularly poetry and philosophy. He spent hours wandering the plantation grounds, often talking with the enslaved workers, asking them questions about their lives, their families, their thoughts. The colonel saw this as weakness. Madeline saw it as something far more dangerous. When Jonathan turned 18, he was sent to Harvard University in Massachusetts. It was 1855, and the tensions between North and South were reaching a breaking point. At Harvard, Jonathan was exposed to ideas that would change him forever. He attended lectures by abolitionists. He read Uncle Tom's Cabin. He met people who believed that slavery was not just wrong, but a moral abomination. He returned to Louisiana in 1857, a changed man, and that change would lead to tragedy that would haunt the Thornhill family for generations. But what Jonathan did, and what was done to him, requires us to understand the full scope of his actions and the conspiracy that developed around him. That story is so shocking, so filled with betrayal and violence, that it deserves to be told completely. We want to thank you, genuinely and sincerely, for staying with us this far into this investigation. What you have heard is disturbing, we know, but we promise you, the most shocking revelations are still ahead. The truth about what happened to Jonathan Thornhill and the events that followed will leave you speechless. When Jonathan Thornhill returned from Harvard in the summer of 1857, his parents immediately noticed the change. He refused to participate in the management of the plantation. He stopped attending social functions. He spent most of his time locked in his room, reading and writing letters. The colonel was furious. He had sent his son to Harvard to receive the education befitting a Southern gentleman, not to come back with radical Northern ideas. Arguments between father and son became frequent and violent. On several occasions, enslaved workers reported hearing shouting and the sound of furniture being thrown. But what the colonel and Madeline did not know was that Jonathan had a secret that, if discovered, would not only destroy him, but potentially bring down the entire Thornhill Empire. In New Orleans, there existed a community of free people of color, many of them educated and cultured. Among them was a young woman named Sarah Devereux. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a free woman of color and a French merchant. She had been educated in France and had returned to New Orleans to open a school for free black children. Jonathan met Sarah at a bookshop in the French Quarter in September 1857. According to letters discovered among her possessions, now held in the Louisiana State Archives, it was not love at first sight. Sarah was deeply suspicious of any white man from a plantation family, but Jonathan was persistent. Over the following months, they met in secret. Jonathan would travel to New Orleans under the pretense of business, but he was really meeting Sarah. Their letters reveal a profound intellectual and emotional connection. They discussed philosophy, politics, literature, and they discussed slavery. Sarah challenged everything Jonathan had been taught. She forced him to confront the reality that his family's wealth was built on the suffering of people who were just as human, just as deserving of freedom as he was. In one letter, Jonathan wrote that talking with Sarah was like waking up from a nightmare and seeing the world clearly for the first time. By early 1858, their relationship had deepened into love. But they both knew it was impossible. Interracial marriage was illegal. If their relationship was discovered, Sarah could face violence or even death. Jonathan would be disowned and ostracized. But Jonathan had a plan, a dangerous plan that would require help from people who were risking their lives to fight slavery. Through Sarah's connections, Jonathan made contact with members of the Underground Railroad operating in Louisiana. The Underground Railroad, for those who may not know, was a secret network of routes and safe houses used to help enslaved people escape to free states and Canada. In the Deep South, this work was incredibly dangerous. Those caught helping enslaved people escape faced prison, violence, or death. Jonathan began using his position to gather information. He learned the patrol schedules. He identified which overseers could be bribed. He discovered boat schedules and routes through the swamps that could be used to avoid detection. And he began quietly making contact with enslaved people at Thornhill Plantation who wanted to escape. His plan was ambitious. He intended to organize a mass escape of over 50 people, providing them with supplies, maps, and money to reach safe houses in New Orleans, from where they would be smuggled north. The escape was planned for June 18th, 1858, but someone betrayed him. Exactly who betrayed Jonathan remains a matter of historical debate. Some evidence suggests it was Silas Blackwood, the overseer, who had become suspicious of Jonathan's behavior. Other evidence points to one of the enslaved workers who had been forced to inform under threat of violence, but the most shocking theory, supported by letters and diary entries only recently analyzed, is that Jonathan was betrayed by his own mother. Madeline's diary entries from May 1858 show that she had become aware of Jonathan's trips to New Orleans. She hired a private investigator to follow him. The investigator discovered not only Jonathan's relationship with Sarah, but also his involvement with the Underground Railroad. On June 15th, 3 days before the planned escape, Madeline confronted Jonathan. No one knows exactly what was said during that confrontation, but an enslaved house servant named Eliza later testified that she heard Madeline screaming that Jonathan had disgraced the family and that she would rather see him dead than see him destroy everything they had built. 2 days later, on June 17th, the night before the escape was to take place, Jonathan became violently ill during dinner. Dr. Morrison, the plantation physician, was called. He diagnosed it as acute food poisoning and prescribed bed rest. Jonathan died 3 hours later in agony. He was 21 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cholera. He was buried quickly, within 24 hours, which was said to be necessary to prevent the spread of disease. The Colonel and Madeline mourned publicly, draping the plantation in black and holding an elaborate funeral. But here is what really happened. In 1998, during renovation work on a building in New Orleans that had once been a medical office, workers discovered a box of old medical correspondence. Among the letters was one written by Dr. Morrison to a colleague in 1859, a year after Jonathan's death. In this letter, Dr. Morrison expressed guilt over something that had been haunting him. He wrote that he had been called to Thornhill Plantation on the night of June 17, 1858, to attend to young Jonathan Thornhill. When he arrived, the young man was already showing signs of severe poisoning. Dr. Morrison recognized the symptoms as consistent with arsenic poisoning, not food poisoning or cholera. He confronted the Colonel and Madeline with his suspicions. According to the letter, the Colonel offered him $10,000 to sign the death certificate listing cholera as the cause of death and to never speak of his suspicions. Dr. Morrison, deeply in debt at the time, accepted. But the letter reveals more. Dr. Morrison wrote that Madeline had shown no emotion when he confronted them. She had simply stated that Jonathan had become a threat to the family and that measures had been taken. The Colonel, according to Morrison's account, appeared shocked and angry, suggesting he may not have known what Madeline had planned. Whether the Colonel was truly ignorant or complicit remains unknown. What is known is that immediately after Jonathan's death, a purge began at Thornhill Plantation. Over the following week, 17 enslaved people who had been involved in Jonathan's escape plan disappeared. The official records state they were sold to plantations in Texas. But no bills of sale have ever been found. No records of their arrival at any other plantation exist. Sarah Devereux, Jonathan's love, was warned by friends that she was in danger. She fled New Orleans and eventually made her way north to Boston, where she lived until her death in 1893. In her final years, she gave interviews about her relationship with Jonathan and the events of 1858. Her testimony, preserved in abolitionist newspapers, provides much of what we know about Jonathan's final months. The escape plan was destroyed. The people who had dared to hope for freedom were either disappeared or so terrified that they never attempted escape again. And Jonathan, the young man who had tried to do something good, was dead, murdered by his own mother to protect the family's wealth and reputation. But the tragedy of Jonathan Thornhill was only the beginning. The seeds of destruction he had planted would eventually grow into something far larger than he could have imagined, and the blood that had been spilled would demand a reckoning. Among the 400 souls enslaved at Thornhill Plantation in 1858, there was a man named Solomon. He was 36 years old, born into slavery on a plantation in Virginia, sold south to Louisiana when he was 20. Solomon was a field hand, considered by the overseers to be strong and obedient. He kept his head down, worked hard, and never caused trouble. That was how he survived. But inside, Solomon carried a rage that burned like a fire that could never be extinguished. 10 years earlier, in 1848, Solomon had been married to a woman named Grace. They had 2 children, a boy named Isaac, who was 8, and a girl named Miriam, who was 6. They lived together in a cabin at Thornhill, and despite the horror of their circumstances, they had each other. Then in the spring of 1849, Grace accidentally spilled hot water on Madeline Thornhill's dress. It was an accident, nothing more, but Madeline's punishment was calculated and cruel. She sold Grace and both children to 3 different plantations. Solomon never saw his family again. For 9 years, Solomon lived with this loss. He worked in the fields and said nothing. He endured the whippings and said nothing. He watched other families torn apart and said nothing. But he was not silent inside. Inside, he was planning. After Jonathan Thornhill's death and the disappearance of the 17 people who had been involved in the escape plan, something changed at Thornhill Plantation. The atmosphere became darker. The punishments became more severe. The overseers, led by Silas Blackwood, increased their brutality to crush any thought of resistance. But the opposite happened. The murder of Jonathan, a white man who had tried to help, convinced many enslaved people that freedom would never be granted. It would have to be taken. Solomon became the center of a conspiracy that would grow over the next year into the largest slave rebellion Louisiana had seen in decades. He began carefully, speaking only to people he trusted absolutely. The conversations happened during religious gatherings, which the plantation allowed on Sunday evenings. The enslaved community would gather to sing spirituals and pray, and the overseers largely left them alone during these times. But those spirituals carried messages. Songs about crossing the River Jordan were actually about escape routes. Songs about the Promised Land contained information about safe houses and contacts. This was not new. Enslaved people across the South had been using music to communicate for generations. But Solomon used it to build a network. By the summer of 1859, Solomon had over 80 people who were part of the plan. Not all of them would fight, but all of them would help. Some would create distractions, some would steal weapons, some would start fires, and some, like Solomon, were prepared to kill if necessary. The plan was set for August 23rd, 1859. It was a moonless night, which would provide cover for escape. The cotton crop had just been harvested, so the plantation was full of buyers and traders, creating confusion that could be exploited. But the goal was not just escape. Solomon had learned from the failure of Jonathan's plan. He knew that even if they escaped, they would be hunted. The colonel had connections throughout Louisiana and beyond. He would use his wealth and power to track them down. Solomon's plan was more radical. They would not just escape. They would destroy the plantation entirely, making it impossible for the colonel to rebuild, sending a message to every plantation owner in the South that there would be a price for their cruelty. On the night of August 23rd, as the plantation slept, Solomon and 12 other men moved through the darkness. Their first target was the weapons shed. They broke in and armed themselves with axes, knives, and 3 rifles that were kept there. Their second target was the stables. They released all the horses, scattering them into the night so they could not be used to pursue escapees. Their third target was the largest cotton barn, which held over $50,000 worth of processed cotton ready for shipment. They soaked it in kerosene and set it ablaze. The fire lit up the night sky like a second sun. Bells began ringing, people began shouting. The overseers and the colonel emerged from their houses in confusion, and then the real rebellion began. What happened over the next 4 hours was chaos. Some enslaved people fled immediately, running into the swamps and forests. Others fought. There were confrontations between the rebels and the overseers. Shots were fired. Blood was spilled. Silas Blackwood, the cruel overseer who had terrorized so many, was killed that night. Exactly how he died is unclear, but his body was found the next morning near the burning barn, beaten to death. 2 other overseers were severely wounded, but survived. And tragically, 3 enslaved people were killed during the chaos, caught in crossfire or killed while trying to flee. But here is what has been hidden from history. Here is what the Thornhill family tried desperately to erase from the records. Colonel Thornhill ordered a response that went far beyond restoring order. He ordered a massacre. As dawn broke on August 24th, local militias arrived to help suppress the rebellion. Under the colonel's direction, they did not just pursue those who had fled. They began rounding up anyone suspected of involvement. Over the following 3 days, according to testimony later given by some of the enslaved people who survived, 47 people were taken to a clearing beyond the cotton fields. They were forced to dig a mass grave, and then they were shot. No trial, no evidence, just execution. The official records state that these 47 people fled during the rebellion and were never found. But in 2018, archaeological excavations at the site of the former Thornhill plantation discovered a mass burial site in the exact location described in the testimony. Forensic analysis of the remains confirmed that the victims had been shot, their bones showing evidence of gunshot trauma consistent with execution-style killings. The ages ranged from teenagers to elderly individuals, men, women, and even children. The discovery made national news and reignited conversations about the true history of slavery and the atrocities that were covered up. As for Solomon and the others who escaped that night, their fate is one of the few bright spots in this dark story. 63 people successfully fled Thornhill Plantation on August 23, 1859. They scattered in different directions, using the chaos to their advantage. Solomon and a group of 19 others made their way through the swamps, guided by someone with knowledge of the Underground Railroad routes. Over the following months, moving only at night, hiding during the day, they traveled north. Records from the Underground Railroad, preserved in archives in Ohio and Pennsylvania, document the arrival of a group of Louisiana refugees in the winter of 1859. The records don't list names for obvious reasons of safety, but the timing and description match Solomon's group. Solomon himself, according to abolitionist newspapers from the 1860s, made it to Canada. He settled in a small community of formerly enslaved people near Toronto. He learned to read and write, he became a speaker for abolitionist causes, and he lived to see the end of slavery in America. But he never forgot what had been done to his family. In an interview given in 1872, reprinted in Frederick Douglass's newspaper, Solomon spoke about the night of the rebellion. He said he did not regret the violence. He said that when peaceful resistance was met with murder, when asking for humanity was met with cruelty, then violence became the only language the oppressor understood. The Thornhill plantation never fully recovered from the events of August 1859. The colonel rebuilt the barn and replaced the overseer, but the financial loss was devastating. More importantly, the rebellion had shattered the illusion of control. Enslaved people at Thornhill and neighboring plantations had seen that resistance was possible. Over the following months, there were smaller acts of defiance. Tools went missing. Crops were sabotaged, work slowed. The colonel responded with increased brutality, but it only made things worse. The plantation that had once been a model of efficiency became a place of constant tension. And then, in April of 1861, the Civil War began, and the world that the Thornhill family had built began to crumble. The Civil War reached Louisiana in 1862, when Union forces captured New Orleans and began moving up the Mississippi River. By 1863, the fighting had reached the region where Thornhill Plantation stood. Colonel Richard Thornhill III declared his loyalty to the Confederacy and contributed substantial funds to the Southern war effort. He believed the South would win and that his way of life would be preserved. He was wrong. In September 1863, Union troops arrived at Thornhill Plantation. What happened next depends on which account you read. The official military records state that the troops were fired upon from the plantation house and returned fire. The colonel's descendants claimed it was an unprovoked attack. What is certain is that the plantation house, that magnificent structure with its white columns and elaborate furnishings, was burned to the ground. Whether it was deliberate or a consequence of fighting, the result was the same. The symbol of the Thornhill family's power was reduced to ashes. Colonel Thornhill himself did not survive. His body was found in the ruins of the house. The official cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation, but some accounts suggest he was shot while trying to flee with boxes of valuables. Madeline Thornhill survived. She fled to her family's home in New Orleans with whatever possessions she could carry. She lived there until her death in 1879 at the age of 51. Her final years were marked by mental decline. Family letters describe her talking to people who were not there, screaming in the night about ghosts and demons. She became obsessed with the idea that she was being haunted by those she had wronged. Her physician diagnosed her with melancholia, what we would now recognize as severe depression and possible psychosis. In her final days, according to her nurse's testimony, Madeline spoke repeatedly about her son, Jonathan. She claimed he visited her at night, covered in blood, asking her why she had killed him. She died alone in her room, and the nurse who found her reported that her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. But the curse of the Thornhill family did not end with Richard and Madeline. The colonel and Madeline had no other children besides Jonathan, but the colonel had two brothers who survived the war. They attempted to reclaim and rebuild the plantation after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the war in 1865. But they faced immediate problems. Without enslaved labor, the plantation was not profitable. The freed people who had worked the land refused to work for the Thornhill family under any circumstances, even for wages. The land itself had been damaged by the war, and there was no money to restore it. The two brothers fought constantly over how to proceed. In 1868, the younger brother, Thomas Thornhill, was found dead in his home under mysterious circumstances. He had been poisoned. His brother, Edward, was suspected but never charged due to lack of evidence. Edward Thornhill attempted to continue operating the plantation with hired labor, but he was a poor manager and a worse businessman. By 1872, he had lost everything to debt. The plantation was seized and sold at auction. Edward died penniless in 1875, an alcoholic living in a boarding house in Baton Rouge, but the story does not end there. The Thornhill family curse seemed to follow the descendants through subsequent generations. Edward's son, Richard Thornhill IV, moved to Texas and made a fortune in cattle. He died in 1889 when he was thrown from his horse and broke his neck. He was 34 years old. Richard's son, Thomas Thornhill II, became a lawyer in New Orleans. He died in 1903 in a house fire under suspicious circumstances. He was 29 years old. Thomas's son, Edward Thornhill II, served in World War I and returned with severe shell shock. He committed suicide in 1923. He was 26 years old. The pattern continued through 5 generations. Every male heir of the Thornhill line died young, often violently or under mysterious circumstances. By the 1960s, the family name had all but disappeared. Now, you might say this is just coincidence. Families face tragedies, People die young for many reasons, and you would be right to be skeptical of any suggestion of a supernatural curse. But there is another way to understand this pattern. Guilt, trauma, and the psychological weight of knowing your wealth was built on the suffering of others can destroy a family from within. Alcoholism, violence, mental illness, these are not curses in the supernatural sense, but they are very real consequences that can be passed down through generations. The land where Thornhill Plantation once stood changed hands many times over the following century. Various owners attempted to farm it, but none succeeded for long. By the mid-20th century, the land had been largely abandoned. In 1997, a developer purchased the property with plans to build a residential subdivision. During the preliminary work, construction crews discovered the ruins of the original plantation house, still there beneath decades of overgrowth. The discovery attracted the attention of archaeologists and historians. Excavations began in 1998 and continued for over a decade. What they found was extraordinary. Beneath the ruins of the main house, they discovered the colonel's vault with the locked ledgers and records. They found Madeline's diaries hidden in the remains of her bedroom. They found the mass grave containing the 47 people executed after the rebellion. But they also found something else. In the area where the enslaved quarters had been, they discovered dozens of small personal items that had been buried or hidden, carved wooden dolls. Simple jewelry made from buttons and scraps of metal, handwritten scraps of paper with names and dates, hidden family records that the enslaved people had kept in defiance of laws that forbade them from learning to write. These artifacts are now housed in the Louisiana State Museum, a permanent reminder of the people who lived and suffered at Thornhill Plantation, a reminder that they were not just numbers in a ledger or nameless victims. They were human beings, with families, with hopes, with dreams. In 2008, the land where Thornhill Plantation stood was purchased by a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving African American history. They created a memorial on the site. Today, if you visit, you will find a park-like setting with walking paths and informational plaques that tell the true history of what happened there. At the location where the mass grave was discovered, there is a monument listing the names of those who died, both during the rebellion and in the massacre that followed. Every year on August 23rd, descendants of the people who were enslaved at Thornhill gather at the memorial for a remembrance ceremony. They sing the same spirituals that Solomon and others used to communicate their plans. They share stories passed down through their families. They ensure that the truth is not forgotten. And what about Solomon's descendants? They found him. Through DNA testing and genealogical research, several families were able to trace their lineage back to Solomon. In 2015, one of his great-great-granddaughters gave a speech at the memorial. She said that Solomon had lived with the trauma of what he experienced for his entire life, but he had also lived with pride that he had fought back, that he had risked everything for freedom. The story of Thornhill Plantation forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history. It reminds us that the wealth and power of some was built on the deliberate, systematic destruction of others. It shows us that slavery was not some abstract historical concept, but a daily reality of violence, cruelty, and inhumanity. But it also shows us resistance. It shows us that even in the darkest circumstances, people fought for their freedom and their dignity. It shows us that some people, like Jonathan Thornhill, were willing to risk everything to do what was right, even when it cost them everything. The documents, diaries, and artifacts discovered at Thornhill Plantation have been studied by historians around the world. They have been used in documentaries, books, and educational programs. They have changed how we understand this period of history by giving us specific, detailed evidence of what really happened, not the sanitized version that was taught for generations. There are thousands of other plantations throughout the South with similar stories, Most of them do not have the detailed records that Thornhill left behind, either because they were destroyed or because they never existed in the first place. But the patterns of cruelty, resistance, and tragedy were repeated over and over. The Manor of Broken Souls, where no one ever fully died, is not just about Thornhill Plantation. It is about all those places where suffering was so intense that it left an imprint that can still be felt today. It is about the souls who refuse to be forgotten, who demand through the historical record that we acknowledge what was done to them. And it is about us, living today, and what we choose to do with this knowledge. Do we look away? Do we minimize? Or do we face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, and ensure that these stories are told honestly and completely? The history of Thornhill Plantation is a reminder that the past is never truly past. The choices made by people over a century and a half ago still echo in our world today. The wealth accumulated through slavery still exists in family fortunes and institutional power. The trauma inflicted on enslaved people is still carried by their descendants, but knowledge is power. Understanding what really happened, seeing the truth in all its horror and complexity, is the first step toward healing and justice. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think about this story? Were you aware of the level of detail and documentation that exists about slavery in America? Do you know of similar stories from your own region or family history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is a conversation we all need to be part of. If this story impacted you, please subscribe to our channel. We are committed to uncovering and sharing true histories that have been hidden or forgotten. There are many more stories like this one that need to be told. And please watch our next recommended video, where we will reveal another chapter of hidden American history that will challenge everything you thought you knew. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for caring enough about truth to stay with us through this difficult but necessary journey into the past.